a wheelchair's twisted wheel, and a shoe. These are the sole remains of one of the central figures of the global Islamic Jihad. A rocket fired by an Israeli helicopter ended the career of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin in Gaza on the evening of March 22, 2004. However successful this hit was, it is only a single episode in the bloody war that the human race is fighting against Islamic fanatics. The year is 1945. Nazism has been vanquished. The bloodiest war in history is over. But the planet had basically been divided into two camps. Two superpowers, representing diametrically opposite ideologies, started a new war, the Cold War. Years of armament buildups, short-term thaws, and long-term crisis periods followed. While the world was occupied with the nuclear threat, political debates, and economic growth, several events that took place in one specific state reverberated loudly at the beginning of the 21st century.
But in my view, the single most important event that was a kind of catalyst for this global jihad was the coming to power in Iran of Ayatollah Khomeini and the establishment of an Islamic theocracy. And that did two things. First of all, from the time of Ayatollah Khomeini onwards, Iran declared war upon the West. None of us really paid enough attention to this at the time, but that's what he said. It's war on the West. We want to Islamize the world. That was the project from Iran. And that in turn, the arrival of that theocracy in Iran radicalized huge numbers of Muslims around the world, not necessarily Shiite Muslims, Sunni as well, because for the first time they saw an Islamic theocracy. They didn't think, that hadn't been in their minds. And so it inspired them, it radicalized them, and that was a key event.
Melanie Phillips had been sentenced to death in absentia. She had been proclaimed a personal enemy of the Prophet Muhammad. Any faithful Muslim who carries out the death sentence is assured of his rightful place in heaven. Melanie's life became a nightmare. She keeps her whereabouts secret. Melanie Phillips doesn't live in some totalitarian state. She lives in London, but at the beginning of the 21st century, London is Islamic territory. The red double-decker hadn't driven 200 yards from the station. In a series of terrorist attacks in London on July 7, 2005, 52 people were killed. 4 Muslim terrorists had simultaneously blown themselves up in 4 busy centers of the English capital. Only the day before, it had been announced that London would host the Olympic Games in 2012. At the turn of the century, Islamic Jihad terrorists had succeeded in transferring the front lines of their battle to the enemy's main cities: New York, Madrid, London, Moscow. Terror was not invented in Iran, yet the ousting of the Shah in 1979 introduced a new term: Islamic terror. On February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to his homeland, and on April 1st, after a national referendum, Iran was officially declared an Islamic republic. Thus, the terrorists rose to power using completely democratic means. History showed us once again that democracy guarantees neither freedom nor peace.
Democracy is not a perfect system. It has been said, and it's true, it's the least worst system that's been invented. But it has many defects, and one of its virtues is turned into a defect. It's one of its main virtues of democracy is its openness, its attachment to ideas, its belief that we should all be free to express ideas, its belief that, in the rule of law. Now, these things are virtues, and we must not lose sight of them. They are very important bedrock values of democracy. But people whose intention is to overturn democracy can therefore make use of these values, can abuse freedom of speech to incite young Muslims to radicalization, to hatred of the West, of Israel, of America, and eventually to violence.
In the modern world, violence and terror do not always get the proper response. Sometimes, retaliation can defeat the objective. Abdelaziz Rantisi became the leader of the Hamas movement immediately after the assassination of Sheikh Yassin. For 25 days, he had been trying to command the Hamas militants from his underground hideaway. On April 17, 2004, a rocket fired by an Israeli helicopter blew Rantisi's vehicle to pieces. No single method for fighting terror exists today. One approach is completely contradictory to the Western concept of democracy. The endorsement of dictators who are in one way or another loyal to the West. Most Arab countries are autocratic. Saudi Arabia, Syria, Egypt, and Libya are ruled by kings or dictators who are officially supported by the people. Elections in those countries usually end up with the unanimous election of a single candidate. In the 1980s, Saddam Hussein was a faithful ally of the United States in the battle against the common enemy, Islamic Iran. But a few years later, he turned his military potential against neighboring Kuwait and Israel.
I'm always giving an example of Egypt. You say there can be no agreement with totalitarian regime. What about Egypt? It's not a democracy. It's a secular totalitarian regime. And you have a good agreement, peace agreement for so many years. Yes, we have agreement with Egypt, which is kept mainly because we have a strong army. But look, just in those 25, or now it's almost 30 years, since we signed that agreement, Israel, attitude towards Israel, especially towards Jews, changed to the worse inside Egypt.